Good morning, everyone. My name is Tamara Anson-Cartwright. I'm with Toronto City Planning. I actually see a few heads kind of nodding off a bit. I was just going to suggest, why don't we all stand up and just shake out our arms a little bit? I think the air in this room is a bit, is not conducive to a Saturday morning. Okay. Okay, I don't need it, but it's good.
Yeah, it's mine.
Okay, great. My talk's over. I've done it. You've got to meet your neighbors. You've socialized. Woohoo! Okay, now on to the more formal program. I have 15 minutes. Okay, someone's got you've got my clock going. I feel like one of those Pechakucha. So here's where I wanted to talk about is the story for me was a talk about an approach and tools for identifying heritage. I joined Toronto City Planning 4 years ago, and I can sometimes relate, I don't like that there's videotaping this, but I can sometimes relate, Julian, to your story of conservation and planning, and should the two coexist. And what I'm especially appreciative, I think, is a story right now to tell you how they collide and actually, I think, can coexist, if possible. And let me just see if I can advance this. Am I got it right? Allison? Oh, good. It's this one right here. So one of the things in preparing for this talk I had to say to myself, and I'm Toronto born and raised, is where are Toronto's main streets? Because what I've heard today is a variety of stories of perspectives on those main streets. And one of the things that I think is really also important to know is this is a discourse that's been going on since the 60s, 70s. I love, Kathy, that you've got the Steve Otto's poster up there. I reread the 1978 proceedings from the provincial government's Conserving Ontario Main Streets. And to tell you the truth, having worked in places like Port Hope and throughout the province helping with historic main streets, it's kind of obvious where the main street is. Not so much obvious in Toronto, and I'll tell a little bit more of why I think that is. But I think the other thing that is really important to understand for us is what was happening at the same time we were talking about conserving the architecture and the community of the main streets was urban planners were doing the morphology study and city patterns of the city. And this is a city document that I've just discovered newly joining city planning that was done through the urban design called City Patterns. If you've not read this book, it's fascinating. And additionally, the Toronto Historical Board, there was an early movement of protecting what was, I would say, the landmark buildings of the City of Toronto. There were 400 that were introduced. This is actually prior to the Act. And if you can note, there are no main streets being identified in this. These are just some snapshots of the 400 buildings that were identified. But in all this work, I think that we've started to see is how important it is actually to understand the evolution of the place and the historic environment. And what I was asking my team, we're a small team of about 10 that are doing the policy and research for the city in heritage properties, is how essential it is to start not with only the visual inspection, but even more so is the historical research. It lies within that understanding of why did these hamlets create or exist, and then the creation of the main street itself. So we can see that we've already sort of, I think, have a good understanding or starting to focus an understanding of the downtown or the city core that we see from very early on to, this was a map that I did for TO Core, an initiative looking at the secondary plan of downtown. And I'm not a planner. You can see I'm already using planning terms. It's a bit scary. But one of the things I think that happened was, while they coexist and has always been the heritage districts, and I had that conversation with Julian in preparation for this, was one of the things that I've observed is that because there are two sections of the Ontario Heritage Act of individual and districts, that we actually start to set up the discourse of that there are landmark buildings or those sort of important buildings, maybe architecturally fine buildings, those large buildings, and then we have a district. And somewhere in between, I actually think there's something that I've been trying to figure out is a group of buildings or perhaps even a little hamlet or a village. And it's really that piece that I've been trying to see how we could not drive our analysis or understanding of what is a main street or a small area, not by what's the legislative tools, but actually just going out and observing and surveying that area. And I'll talk a little bit further. But to get there, I had to start to work within the forest of city planning and understand what they call the urban structure. And this whole approach of what are the avenues and where does density should go. This was a discourse, I guess probably started 15 years ago, of where do these new infill density called mid-rise occur. But there was a recognition that there was something important along these avenues that wasn't just erase the whole built environment. So there was a study around character areas. There was also this identification that there could be potential heritage districts. Kind of scares me to see how many dots there are actually on that map, but that there was something that meant that you couldn't just completely erase the built form. And so what happened, I think, for me is arriving in 2015 at City Planning was a really interesting opportunity. I got a phone call saying, Tamara, we're doing this massive secondary plan at Yonge and Eglington, and we're already into phase 2, and by the way, we've not done the historic buildings in the area. We don't quite know what they are, and the community has said it's important to include a heritage survey. And it was the great work of Taylor Hazel. I see Ellen Kowalchuk is here. And what I would say, and recognizing some of the community members that are here in the audience, was what a great opportunity for us of collaboration and consultation. And it was not just about experts looking to see what is heritage. It got a little heated at one point when people said, these are old buildings of streetcar suburb and they're just fabric buildings, so why are you wanting to protect them? And regrettably, I put in the comment in the staff report, it's unprecedented to list 265 buildings at one time, and it was unprecedented that I should say that, and I won't say that ever again. But what was really important from behind the scenes, what I think is that it was now that our heritage policies were in the official plan, rather than two sort of silos of heritage and planning. And what we discovered was that incredible understanding of, ecosystem of something like, and this was to try and get some a bit trees in it, the trees that surround a commercial area. This is, of course, Mount Pleasant Cemetery, looking at, and just onto Davisville. But what I also discovered is that we don't have the opportunity to do all these huge initiatives like TO Core and Midtown in Focus, and how could we start to involve and integrate heritage survey in a variety of planning tools? And so this was just a quick run through now of some of the things that we've started to do for ourselves. And specifically is looking at urban design guidelines. This was a chance for us to actually integrate the history and the built form. If you don't know what the word built form is, looking at the buildings along the street itself. And I'm just going to go through a variety of these things of how I try to marry the two things. So one is an urban design tool, the other is the Ontario Heritage Act. The other was in Dundas Roncesvalles urban design. We also then said, we're not going to, at this time, add anything on the Heritage Register, but we can have a map of heritage potential, and it wedded it within the policy itself. And you can see on this map some of the properties. This was, knowing that John was going to speak about streetcar suburbs, I sort of talked about a few of them. Danforth Avenue, we did a survey of the buildings along there. We did this policy. We also did urban design guidelines. And now we've been involved with, or I've been involved in a technical committee on the unlocking and having a master plan for the rehabilitation of the streetcar car house itself on Danforth. Stay tuned on that. It's going to be amazing. So last but not least is the heritage districts throughout the city. These are just a few of the districts that we are looking at of commercial streets that my team is currently working on. So from West Queen West, Parkdale, Kensington Market, Cabbagetown Southwest, and Riverside. The one that we just went out to the community last week was on Bloor West Village, and a focus on a very large study area, but the focus of our consultants was looking at character analysis and understanding the variety of commercial properties within the core, the village itself. And you start to see what the pattern is of not only, I would say, is there's not a lot about sort of saying grand architecture. It is about fine grain. It's about the patterns. It's about the construction of the buildings. And what you end up with is understanding that this is about an ensemble or a creation of a small village from the 1910, up to the 1930s. And they did incredible detailed typology analysis. I think that this is one of the things that we can only say is the beginning of the discourse. We need to now better understand the community and how they use the village, because I frankly think that this is a village that is in that major transition that maybe needs to have a better understanding of what are those shopkeepers. All of these shops, whenever we meet with the commercial property owners and the BIA, they're all saying they're suffering their loss of their businesses. And I think that it's interesting just to have that discourse, not only with Heritage, but also with the shop owners themselves. So what is the trend? I just sent out to Kathy that the city has just released a survey on retail main streets. So what's next in modernizing the city's heritage register? Well, first of all, it's recognizing that we need to modernize it. And that's been my great joy and interest of joining at this time of my career at the city. And so we're putting forward a proposal right in this year to City Council of looking at a heritage survey across the city and not be guided by where the planning study's occurring, but understanding the morphology and the history of itself. And the way that we're proposing our approach is based on the communities and understanding the 140 communities rather than the commercial core strip itself. And the other is that we're piloting our survey techniques, and right now we have a pilot project of King Parliament, and the idea is that it's based on a context statement, a historic context and understanding of the area, because again, not all these buildings are grand architecture, but if you start to understand how this place developed, you'll have a better sense of what we will actually identify as heritage potential. And I couldn't close without saying that we also look at heritage incentives, and we're starting to look at, again, our tax rebate and how we might need to consider some fine tweaks to that, because one of the things is that you can see it says commercial industrial. Well, many of the retail and small Main Street buildings actually have residential above, and then they don't meet within the eligibility of the tax program itself. Thank you.